had it arranged that David Williams from NHFT was going to, Director of Strategy, was going to come and speak to us about the two collaboratives that are being designed for the new integrated care system, the mental health and elective collaborative. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, he let us know that he wasn't going to be able to come. So I decided that actually, you know what, we can discuss these papers without them being presented to us because we've had them to read. And actually, it'll give us a lot more time to delve into the nitty-gritty of the papers we've been presented, because we won't have to listen to a half-an-hour presentation before each one. So I thought, actually, you know, rather than scrapping our agenda and trying to get new papers to you, which you wouldn't have had in time for the meeting, I thought that this was the best way forward. So I hope you're all happy with that. I firmly believe we'll have a really good discussion that we can then feed in to the system over to NHCP and let them know our thoughts on what they're proposing. So I think these papers are fairly early, ideas. So we'll be getting in quite early in the discussions on this, which I think is important. So that's my only, the only announcements that I wanted to make. Apologies for absence. With John McGee has sent his apologies. I was about to say Jeff, but Jeff's managed to get his power up and running again, so he's with us, which is great to see. And Francesca, we haven't had any others, have we? No. So if we move on to members' declarations of interest, do we have any today? Lovely. And then the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of December. Are there any comments arising, any inaccuracies or comments arising from those minutes? That looks like a no. So are we all happy to accept those minutes as a true record? Some thumbs? Yeah, good. Lovely, thank you. So without further ado, we'll move on to the mental health collaborative. In here it says mental health, learning disabilities and autism program. The collaborative is around mental health. It doesn't include at this point learning disabilities and autism. So I wonder if I don't think I'm going to be particularly good at presenting sort of the overall picture. I wonder if David could maybe give a really bare bones outline of the paper. Really bare bones, because more than anything I want you guys to be able to say your thoughts about what you've read so far. Is that okay, David, if I chuck it to you?
Yeah, it might help if I give a little bit of background and context, just so all members are sort of aware where these collaborative proposals are coming for, because not all of you are members of Health and Wellbeing boards, so may not have had the same sort of exposure to some of the discussions that have been happening in that sense. So members may be aware that we currently have the Northamptonshire Health and Care Partnership, which for a number of years has been trying to provide the strategic direction for delivery of health and care across Northamptonshire. It brings together representatives from acute hospitals, clinical commissioning groups, social care, public health, primary care, health watch, voluntary sector, or being representatives on that board. And over, certainly predating me, by predating me, I don't mean since 1976. I mean since I came back to Northamptonshire. There has been a programme which has been setting out 4 areas of focus for the Health and Care Partnership. One of them has been around mental health. The second has been around elective care. The third around children and young people. And the fourth around integrated care across Northamptonshire, or ICAN, as it's lovingly referred to. And the 2 papers that are coming today are effectively bringing the cases for change for the mental health collaborative and the Elective Care Collaborative. And using health speak, elective care really refers to any sort of healthcare that tends to happen in the acute hospitals that is not as a result of an emergency. So, for example, you may have been struggling with a dodgy hip or a dodgy knee for a period of time, and you get referred by your GP for consideration for a knee replacement or a hip replacement. It's done on an elective basis, not an emergency basis. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about elective care, those sorts of procedures that take place. So those are the backgrounds. What I would say is the mental health collaborative proposals and ways of working are a lot more advanced than the elective care at this moment in time, hence the size of the document and the background that goes into it, the timelines that are there that show you with that. But it shows where as a system we have got to and what our proposed plans are moving forward. This is very much trying to set the case for why we should take a collaborative approach rather than solve these problems as individual organisations, and sets out what we mean by a collaborative and how it may work. So there's very different ways of doing that, you know, with having lead organisations or host organisations, or you know, there's different models that you can take, and this is what this paper does. It brings forward those proposals, and I'm keen that, having heard from members on this executive advisory panel, that we try and get early sight of these sorts of policy ideas or discussion papers which are being used to inform the approaches of the health and care partnership, but also the integrated care system moving forward. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context around that. I mean, I'm happy to jump into the paper and start going through it, but I would just do a bad job of what David Williams was supposed to have done if he had been here. So I'm more happy if members have got particular questions or areas that they want to explore in more detail, that you point us to the relevant pages. If I can answer your questions, I will. If I can't answer your questions, that's where I think we then gather that as feedback that we give back to David. And what we have suggested is we could ask David and his colleagues to come back in the March meeting and tell us what they considered around our responses and whether they plan to feed any of that into the further iterations of this piece of work. So hopefully that gives you context, members, and hopefully you'd agree with that as a proposal. Otherwise, you'll have me meandering through the report. So I think if we could stick to assume you've had a read through it, and there's probably areas you want to dig into in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think that's really important, the sort of point towards the end of that about how we want to make sure that the discussions we have today are actually fruitful, so that they do get fed through to the team, and that we do have a feedback mechanism that tells us that, yes, we heard what you said, we took those discussions forward in this way, you know, because otherwise there's very little point in us becoming part of the collaborative process of building these collaboratives, you know. So I think it's really important that the EAP does have some feedback, and so hopefully we'll get David Williams back, as David says, at the March meeting. And I wonder if I could kick off with a really simple question, David, because my understanding is that both of these two collaboratives, the proposal is for a lead provider collaborative. But what I don't think is spelt out in either of these documents is who those lead providers would be. I think it's NHFT for the mental health one, but I think I only know that because I've heard that. And I'm not at all clear about who that would be for the elective pathway.
Okay. Without going through it, I would be in agreement with you that yes, NHFT would likely be the lead. I guess the question which you might want to ask or consider or have a bit of a discussion around is whether as a group you agree with that, or by having that as a lead organisation, is that the right place for it to sit? There's lots of discussions about, do we not do enough in the way of prevention or well-being around mental health, and would it make sense for other organisations to potentially lead in that place, be it a GP-led approach or a social care-led approach, or so it's worth discussion, and provide, if you've got particular questions around that, which I'm not able to answer, I think that would be good. It makes sense for it to be the acute hospital group that is the lead for the elective care, albeit that the clinical commissioning group, as it is at the moment, will commission elective care elements from the private sector as well. But if the hospital group were to effectively be the lead, you would almost be saying, well, the commissioning of additional capacity from the private sector would effectively be led by the group hospital at that point, is my understanding of potentially how it would work.
Yeah, so I think that the reason I asked that question is because it does lead on to the question that David just posed to us, which is so if you think about I don't know whether at the minute I'm kind of talking about both of these two collaboratives all at the same time, but we may start to break it into the two different. I think we probably will break it into the two separate ones in a moment, but I was just thinking that's a really important point. That so if NHFT is the lead provider for the mental health collaborative, at the moment they provide probably the bulk of mental health care across Northamptonshire. So on the one hand, you can think, well, that makes a huge amount of sense. They're already doing a huge amount of that work. Most of the funding goes into their systems. And they provide most of the care across Northamptonshire. However, you then might ask the question. The question that comes into my mind is, okay, but aren't we trying to look at doing things in a different way? And if the lead provider is currently providing most of that care, there may not be, but there may be a tendency to continue to, although you're working collaboratively, still have the bulk of the care in the same places, where what I think we want to see across the system is far more early intervention, prevention, treatment in the community closer to home, more treatment or more services delivered by the voluntary sector. And so I suppose the question would be, do we think that the provider that is providing so much of that care in hospitals, in the community, etc., will they have that vision to move funding into the earlier phases of help and care, or would they be protective of the services they currently have and want to protect them and keep the money in those systems? Now, I'm not saying they would, but it's a question that's worth thinking about. And I guess it's the same in elective care. So if the hospitals, the acute trusts, are going to be sort of controlling the money the money flow and where services are going to be provided, there's lots of good stuff in the documents about how it's going to change. But will that catalyst for change be as strong in a system like that? So I think that might be a really good opening question for you all. So hands up anyway. Sorry, welcome Chrissy. So just spotted you've come in. So that's an opener. So over to you guys. Jeff.
Yeah, I'm going to be very simplistic on this, I'm afraid, but I mean, can somebody just explain to me exactly what the lead is going to be doing? Because I think I know, but I tend to agree that if we're going to change things, perhaps we ought to look at who's actually going to lead it and how they're going to do it. I just wonder what they are actually meant to do, please.
So if I can bring members' attention to, sorry, there's 2 page numbers on here. So I think it's page 38 of the overall pack, which gives you a little bit around the programme structure and governance structures that would be put in place. This would hopefully give you a bit of an idea around how the leadership of it's structured. So whilst you may have a lead provider putting the majority of the resource into it, clearly the system will have other ways of holding to account in the same way that we do within the council. So we have these executive advisory panels, we have scrutiny, we have other boards in order to deliver that forward. And sort of page 38 and 39 set out those governance structures. Does that help, Councillor Shacklock, in sort of explain some of that? Because the question that we may have back, or that the panel may have back, may not be about, well, is it right or wrong? It's how does the collaborative itself hold itself to account with these, and how does it make some of those? So there will be a rationale and a reason as to why a lead organisation is chosen. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means what, you know, how do we get assurance that those sorts of things won't happen as a result of NHFT being that lead organisation? And that may be something we want to seek clarity from colleagues from NHFT when they come back to the March meeting.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, David. I suppose I was just playing the devil's advocate for a little while there. That was all I was doing. Thank you.
Just to give you a bit of an idea on the money, so I've not specifically looked in Northamptonshire, but every other local authority that I've worked in, it has fallen very neatly on 90% of mental health spend happens in your mental health community provider. 10% of that spend happens in local government. So it's a relatively small amount that we are spending on mental health support in local government. And it tends to be people at the higher end, believe it or not. So they've gone through acute phases of mental health, but they've got, long, more chronic needs for support and housing and the right sort of accommodation and care around them. And it tends to be those elements that we pick up, but we also pick up elements of the preventative bits through things like public health, our voluntary sector contracts, etc. Whereas the more expensive mental health care, which happens in places like NHFT, will be around things like psychology, psychiatric support, talking therapies, inpatient beds, and things like community psychiatric nursing wrapped around people who are maybe experiencing poor mental health in the community, but don't need to be admitted to a hospital bed in order to receive assessment or treatment.
Chrissy.
Apologies for lateness, Chair, and I wish to declare an interest on this issue as I am the council representative on the Board of Governors for NHFT. I do have lots of thoughts on this, but if you want me to step back, then I'm happy to do so because of my position.
We're not decision making, Councillor Smith-Haynes. So I think you've declared the interest, and we just need to understand whether you are asking a question or providing information when you do on the basis of your board member role, or as a councillor and member of the EAP at the time. So if you just be clear around that, I think, would you agree, Francesca?
Yes, I'm happy with that.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to make a comment with regards to NHFT having excellent CQC, which is second year running, I believe. They are doing a very good job, and it is very difficult circumstances. So I'll just put that out there. I do like the fact that we have our services spread across a number of organisations, because particularly where mental health is concerned, some people who become patient/service users will find that they prefer one organisation over another. So I do think it's important to have some choice in the marketplace. I know we've been in this report talks about eliminating duplication and filling gaps. But what I'm trying to say is that in as much as if you had to have an elective operation, you get a choice of which hospital you go to. I think it's important that if you need mental health care, you get a choice of venues or service providers who can offer that support. It doesn't mean that the money doesn't come from the same pot. We have one lead provider, but the work should be commissioned out. Have I made sense with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think my understanding is that obviously once we become an integrated care system, but what is currently Northamptonshire Health and Care Partnership, well, at the moment it'd be the clinical commissioning group who does the commissioning, and so my understanding is that the new integrated care board will have overall responsibility for commissioning of services, but I think that with this lead provider model, that commissioning function will be trickled down to the lead provider within and the collaborative. So what I guess what my question is this. So we're going to be looking at a whole system approach to delivering mental health care services. And currently, as David said, I think it was 90% of spend on mental health services goes through the trust, and the local authority is responsible for has about 10% of the funding and that provides these services. So my question is, within the new collaborative, as once it gets up and running and pots of money are pooled and this lead organisation and the collaborative decides where services are going to be and how money is going to be spent, could that ultimately lead to a new balance in where that spend is? So I know this is going to be a hugely controversial thing to say, but could money that currently is NHS money end up being deciding to commission a service that is run by the local authority? So suddenly NHS money is being spent by the local authority. Is that a possibility within this new system?
Absolutely, and we already do that through things like the Better Care Fund at this moment in time. So through Section 75 agreements, that can absolutely happen. Or it might be that through this model, there might be a decision made to say, well, actually, rather than spending money in this area, we would like to do more investment into the voluntary sector, so that people are getting a more universal offer around mental health and wellbeing. And it would be the collaborative that would make that decision, and then the lead provider would commission that support from wherever was deemed most appropriate.
And again, I was looking at the decision-making process through the pillars and then into I forget what each of the different levels of this organisation are going to be, but ultimately the decision was made by Gateway 3, accountability of finance. I've got so it basically went to the executive group would make the decision on a service and the funding for that. So it looked to me like the ICS would be informed of that decision, but it didn't look to me like the ICS board would have a yes or a no function in that. It looked like from this, it's on page 53 or 46, depending on which page numbers you're looking at. It looked like the responsibility does stay within the collaborative rather than having to go up to the ICS board to say yes or no. That's what it looked like.
Yes, I would agree with you as that. And what I would say is this is relatively untested. So the mental health collaborative is our most advanced one at the moment. And clearly within the early development of this, and as this progresses forward, we will have to have an audit process to understand decision making, whether it made the right decisions, whether it's got processes in place in order to do that. And that's the role certainly that the different committees underneath the ICS partnership would potentially do. So you've got a system finance committee that may say, actually, we want to look at some of those financial decisions that have been made within the mental health collaborative, and therefore they would call that in or review that information in that sense. So my interpretation of it and my understanding of it is the same as yours, Councillor Harrison.
Thanks. King, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so just sort of listening to those interventions, I'm thinking that NHFT, although outstanding as Councillor Haynes has mentioned, I'm speculating around the fact that are they the best to lead this collaborative? Just because if you look at statistics like the 17.9 million working days that was zapped from our efficiencies around the nation between 2019-20, that's a huge number of days missed. Not utilised because of things like anxiety, stress, and depression. And I guess I'm just sort of speculating. I'm not making any sort of decision, judgments on this. But if it was sort of community-led, voluntary sector-led, or GP-led, they can sort of focus more into the commissioning of these mental health programmes, looking at real sort of prevention. You mentioned prevention, Chair, things that could actually prevent our society from sort of developing these sort of mental health issues that are taking these times. That's taken a lot of day working, and I guess just sort of thinking about this whole thing, things like EAP commissioning, employee assistance programs, would NHFT be commissioning that, sort of feeding through the local authorities, GPs, community sector, in order to sort of get those into employers, mental health first aiders. I'm sure we're all aware of that, and that's sort of coming in. And I think that on the prevention piece, getting to kids first, because of all these problems that are coming in with systems like social media and cyberbullying and all these sorts of likes and dislikes, is the structures in place within this piece to sort of prevent kids from sort of developing mental health because of these channels, and again radicalization, and dealing with kids as sort of an initial stage to not get to that point of being radicalized, or working with them quite quickly out of that. And I think that's namely going to be within the voluntary sector that deals with stuff like that. And also items like working with local faith groups, because that sometimes works best with particular people within those faith groups, to sort of that sort of faith-based therapies that can work more than just the talking therapies in the sort of the secular kind. Those are just some sort of ideas around my thinking, whether it's right that we sort of go down the NHFT route, which is going to be sort of, they've been doing this for sort of past times. Do they have the right preventative approaches to sort of tackle some of these things that I've mentioned? And those are just some of the initial thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Harrison, I think it's really good if we try and sort of capture, because this feels like a bit of a feedback that you'd want to give along the lines of, read through the document, it still feels quite institution heavy.
Yeah.
And you'd want to see something within the case for change that sets out more about how the collaborative would work with other much more place-based or localized or community interest group orientated to deliver better outcomes.
Yeah.
So if I don't know whether I've articulated it how you would want it to go back, King, but I think that's probably what the sort of feedback that we want to give, that it feels quite institution heavy. We would like to see a little bit more in the way of examples around how you would achieve moving from being institution heavy to focusing on the right organisation, delivering the right care at the right level.
Yeah, absolutely. You've articulated it well, David. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really really helpful. And I think the other thing that runs through that document quite a lot is the idea of equality of all the different partners within this collaborative, equality of voice and influence and so on. I can't remember the exact words they use, but it's a little bit hard to see that in practice, and there's a. I mean, again, this is an early document, but it's much more, as you say, developed than the elective care one, and it doesn't actually spell out who. It talks about organisations that will be part of the collaborative, but it's quite difficult to sort of get a feel of who's going to be in the room at different points, making different, arguments and decisions. So I think some assurance around the fact that this will genuinely be a partnership that, a collaborative where, our voices are equal. I think David's just back again. So he disappeared from the chat for a moment. So I think that's quite important, that we can see that's not just warm words, that will be real. And then I'll come to, sorry, Russell, I'll come to you in a sec. I've just got one other thing that throughout the whole reading of this has quite alarmed me, and that is these massive sort of what I would call management structures. I mean, they're absolutely enormous. The number of groups feeding into the number of groups feeding into the number of groups, and that worries me because, I mean, is this whole new infrastructure going to be replacing something that already exists? So I'm sure clinical commissioning group, they already had a lot of these functions. So perhaps some of those clinical commissioning group functions are going to be absorbed into these new functions. But if NHFT is going to be the lead provider of this, is it going to take away from their current management structures? Is it going to be a duplication of current management structures that have to go alongside already? I mean, it's the main thing that's blown my mind is looking at these structures. It looks like huge numbers of people are going to be going into planning our services and delivery of our services. Probably a lot of quite highly paid people doing that. And I just worry about that. It's incredibly complex and incredibly management heavy. So that's just another point I'd like to make on. And then just David, you might want to come back on that.
Just to help Francesca, are you still referring to page 51 when you're referring to that, or right, page 51 or 44, depending on which page you're reading? Yeah, because it's helpful if we can give the page numbers to David, just to say this looks heavy. Is this all about planning, or is some of this about delivery, and does it replace existing structures? If so, it's probably helpful for them to call out what things will stop happening as a result of putting this in place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's page 51 that I'm looking at the minute. And just as an example, there's the strategic steering group that goes into the collaborative, and when I read the descriptions of what the two did, it sounded almost identical, and I'm just like, why is there two structures there? If you go back to page, it won't be in there, it'll be back here. Sorry, bear with me. It was a long document.
It's spot on, Jay. I found it quite heavy as well, and sort of bureaucratic. Sort of, if you want to get services commissioned or anything done, it goes through huge groups and organisations, and I'm on the same boat.
Yeah. Anyway, I can't find that other page, but it's just, are every single step of those structures necessary? What will they be replacing? Are they going to be adding new levels of bureaucracy to our health and care system? I think those are the questions that I wanted to ask. So I hope that's fairly clear. Russell, you wanted to come in now.
Well, it's great to be last because most of what you were going to say has been discussed. But when I read the document, I wrote in the margins the word simple. Keep it simple. And I think you've had a good discussion on the fact that when you've got a melding of things like this, you can come out the other end trying to have everybody on board and everybody having a say and everybody having that little bit of power to do what they want to do. We need to be very clear about what the drive engine is that's going to deliver the results that we're looking for. I did a little bit of talk to a few people because, you know, I don't know much about this sort of stuff. And one of the feedback that I got is that there is a perception about accessing services isn't as good as we might think it is. And we need to take that on board. And you've got to meld the budget. It's the old chunter that I tend to do, you know that, Helen. It's bringing the budgets together. Perhaps there may be enough money, but it's in the wrong place. And people have got to be not precious about their budgets. We've got to have a way of sorting that out. So I just feel that coming together, we're at our best when we do truly come together, have a moratorium, decide our objectives and go for it, so that people just tell their story once and they get the help and support they want. At the moment, I would suggest, certainly in mental health, we're very much struggling on the front line, I think. Yeah. And goodness knows what's going to happen when we truly unlock and find the true extent of the damage that's been done to an awful lot of people over the last 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. Your points are really well taken. I was just about to introduce you to Dr. John Ashton, who's come on the call, who is our Interim Director of Public Health.
Oh, God.
Are you still here? Is John still on? I
wondered who he was.
He's probably looking for his mute button if he's not familiar with Zoom rather than
he's switched his camera and he's off and he's on mute. So hopefully he'll come on in a sec, because John's background is in mental health, and he's been somebody who's worked primarily in psychiatric in his early career, in treating people with severe mental illness, and then wanted to go downstream and get much more into preventative and early interventions to stop people getting to the point at which they need that level of treatment. And I think he would probably love to talk about some of the things we're talking about here. Because it's absolutely, my view is, and I'm sure, I think this is a view I think that is shared across the system, but I'm not 100% convinced that we're at the point where we're going to deliver it yet. The view across the system is that we need to get much better at prevention, early intervention, keeping people well at home, all those kinds of things. But we massively spend on sorting problems out once they've occurred, and as a system, and we spend very much less on prevention, early intervention, and those types of things. And if we want to change that balance, it seems to me that these collaboratives, the new integrated care system ideals, are where that should happen. So when John comes back on, I'll get him to talk to you a bit about his thoughts on that, because that might be helpful as well. I hope he's looked at this this collaborative.
He has got his hand up now, so looks like he may be in a position to put his mic off mute. John.
Okay, yeah, John, go for it. You're on mute at the moment and your camera's off, but
apologies. The bin men had just arrived, and the dogs go crazy when the bin men come. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. I hope over the barking of the dogs you were able to hear roughly what we were talking about.
No, I did get the gist, but I'm still catching up with where mental health fits into the council. For those who don't know, I mean, my background early in my clinical career was I trained as a psychiatrist after qualifying in medicine, and I've carried with me through all the years an interest in prevention in psychiatry and mental health. And in recent years, I've actually given quite a lot of attention to what's now being called public mental health, which is applying public health principles to the whole area of mental health. And in the day that I'm not with you in Northamptonshire, I'm working with Grampian in Scotland on a public mental health strategy. So I hope that perhaps Northamptonshire can benefit from some of the thinking that we've put into that. So, you know, I really need to understand better in my steep learning curve where mental health fits into, you know, the different parts of the council. What I would say about long COVID, though, is that we really are at an early stage in understanding it. I mean, we do know that it's going to be a big problem. The nature of the symptoms that people are experiencing, apart from specific organ damage, and remember, this virus goes for most of the major organ systems. I mean, it attacks the brain, it attacks the heart, it attacks the liver. You know, it because of the thrombotic element to it, the little thromboses that you get in different end organs. So people will turn up in different specialist medical areas with problems resulting from that. But the syndrome that seems to be being described is similar to ME, with fatigue and you know, diffuse symptoms that are not well understood. And anybody who's had any dealings with this area will know that ME is a very politically contentious area. When I use the word political, I mean in relation to, there's been a lot of conflict between patients and their families and clinicians about the nature of that, and to what extent, if any, there's a psychological overlay component which you know, perpetuates the symptoms over time. And for example, the role of graded exercise in treatment management. Anyway, you know, it looks as though there are, I think I calculated on the back of some preliminary epidemiology that there may be 13,000 people in Northamptonshire who may be suffering from long COVID. And it doesn't take you more than a minute to realize that you're not going to be able to set up specialist services for 13,000 people. And that this will have to be managed in the community, and that primary care GPs and all their teams will need to become familiar and adept at supporting people with long COVID, and that we will need to support voluntary groups that spring up to deal with this, mutual support and that kind of thing. So we'll need a strategic approach to long COVID. So we'll need a kind of sub-strategy for it, and decide how to invest resource in that for the optimal population benefit. So that's a piece of work that somebody's going to have to do at some point. And then just coming back to the public mental health versus psychiatry for a moment. The problem historically, when people have tried to get into prevention with mental health, is that because of the pressure of severe and enduring mental illness, and the fact that this area is a shortage specialty for clinicians, hopefully there's some change going on with the new cohorts of medical graduates being more interested in mental health. But historically, doctors have not wanted to go into this area of practice, and recruitment's always been a problem. And the investment, as we know, has been a problem too. So you've had this argument over the recent years about a parity of treatment between physical and mental health, and investing properly. But, you know, for example, the waiting times for child and adolescent mental health services are totally unacceptable. And very often youngsters come to grief before they can get near the service. So, you know, one has to have a parallel track here where we together sort out mental health services, but at the same time address prevention, as Councillor Harrison's indicated. So I hope that helps, Helen. You know, you can see there's a lot to do, but it's also potentially very exciting, because when you get into the preventive agenda, a lot of what needs to happen, for example, Planned Parenthood, aiming for babies being born into family units that are in a position to nurture the child. The first 1,000 days of life, we know, adverse childhood events, school readiness so that children don't get alienated from school and finish up on the streets getting involved in gangs and such like. And then readiness for the world of work at 18. These kind of strands of a preventive strategy for mental health will have huge benefits for other areas of public health that we're interested in, such as alcohol and substance misuse and violence and obesity and so on. So if we get a public mental health strategy right, this could potentially be a very efficient and effective way of ticking lots of other boxes. It's work that needs to be embarked on. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. So I'm going to pose a cheeky question back to you, John. So we've just been talking about who's the lead sort of provider within this collaborative, and it's assumed it's going to be NHFT, who provides the majority of mental health care services across Northamptonshire. My cheeky question back to you is, given the drivers of what cause mental health problems in the first place, shouldn't it be public health that are the lead provider?
Well, I would always say that, and I think there are a number of areas like this. But the important thing about this is to say, as with so much of public health, the role of public health is as a kind of guide and catalyst. It's not doing everything. It's actually getting everybody onto the same page and seeing what the contribution is of all the different parts of the council and wider civic society, business, the voluntary sector, and so on. So it's a kind of not conductor of the orchestra, but it's more of a facilitator and describing the issues in a way which people can see where they've got a part to play.
So it writes the sheet music rather than conducts the orchestra, John.
Thanks for that, David.
There you go.
David, you've had your hand up for ages. Go for it.
I have. I just wanted. I'm conscious that when I summarised King's, Councillor Llewell's contribution earlier on, I missed the children's bit around that, and you did make quite a few points around that. So what I wanted to do was just share my screen to just show that this collaborative is focusing on adult mental health, and this may be again something that the panel may want to feed back, is whilst there's a commitment on this page of the Case for Change to work with the Children and Young People Collaborative or Transformation Programme, you may want to ask more around, well, how are you going to make sure that happens? How are you going to make sure that, again, if the majority of the resource is currently spent in adult mental health areas, how do you make sure that the resource flows through to children's, for example, to CAM services, to make sure that we're getting in earlier? Because if we don't deal with childhood or youth mental health, that becomes a much more challenging problem to solve as an adult. So I just wanted to pull that back because I didn't think I gave that justice, and I think when John started talking about it, sort of prompted me. So hopefully that reflects maybe some of the feedback which the panel would want to give in that space as well.
Yeah, David, I think that's really important. I forgot that as well, because I was noting that this is primarily about adult mental health, and that the other a different pillar is going to be dealing with children and young people, and we need to make sure that those flow together, and that the mental health treatment of children is properly funded and recognised in that system. So I think that's a point that we would definitely want to be putting back to them. And then again, I had another thing that just jumped into my mind, and as I was reading through the document. So again, you know, there's a lot of nice stuff that talks about the drivers of poor mental health, and you know, the causes of the causes, and the wider determinants of health, and so on. And I don't think I actually see anywhere within the collaboration, although yes, the local authority is part of the collaboration. I don't see within that, and it was John's comments about prevention. I don't see much in there about how we're going to work with, you know, across the system. So, for example, perhaps with housing, looking at education, looking at good jobs. I know, you know, there's all sorts of stuff out there that you know, we as a council have a big influence on, but I don't really see genuinely as being something that's wrapped up in this collaborative. I'm not sure, again, I may be being unfair, but you know, if we talk warm words about the drivers, that, you know, the causes of the causes, and all our buzzwords about you know, you know, really important things about what causes poor mental health and poor health in general, we need to be genuine about wanting to focus on resolving some of those problems. And you know, more and more I'm beginning to think that one day, if I'm ever Prime Minister, I'm going to chuck loads and loads of money at local government and try and make sure that we're delivering all those things and preventing all of the problems further up the chain. But anyway, so that was just another point, and I think that might want to be taken forward as a comment as well, if that's okay, Francesca. I see John has his hand up again, so I'll go to John.
I'll be quick. I was just coming on the back of David's embellishment. I think, you know, in the public health perspective would really see work around prenatal, childhood, adolescence as being where the real prevention work can take place. You know, by teenage years, between 10 and 15% of children and adolescents are already in serious trouble of one kind or another, whether conduct disorder or emotional and psychological. And that's where we can prevent a proportion of that by having a concerted approach to getting them to 18 without having the problems which are then going to hang around them for the rest of their lives. Once you get above 18 or 23, whatever we're calling children and young people these days, you're into what we would call harm minimization, trying to reduce the damage and the impact on others of people who've been damaged already. And that's where you get into things like arrest referral for violence and alcohol and so on, where the police collaboration has an important role of getting people who are already beginning to be domestically violent or violent in other kinds of ways, diverting them into treatment and behavior change and such like. The task of adult life for all of us is the avoidance of despair. That's the psychological task, is actually having a satisfying, meaningful life. And by the time you get to, you know, middle life, that's, you know, the maximum suicide rates in men are late 30s, early 40s, and that's an indicator of what we're talking about here. So a big push on the under 18s and rites of passage, which are missing for such a large proportion of teenagers in modern society. I mean, if you go and look at Margaret Mead's work in the South Pacific in the 1920s and 30s, and she described what happens in tribes, how, you know, young people get put through difficult tasks. This is the nature of a rite of passage. And when they emerge at the other end, having achieved this difficult task, they are accepted into the adult community with rights and responsibilities. Now, in modern Western life, you get that if you go to medical school or law school or business school, or, you know, going to the police or what have you. But a lot of kids don't have that. A lot of the traditional trade union routes have gone. And what happens is teenagers make up their own rites of passage if they don't get offered rites of passage. And we really need to get better at offering them rites of passage, which give them this enhanced self-esteem and feeling that they're part of the adult community, and that brings with it rights and responsibilities. So, you know, that's all a way of thinking that I would offer you. And I think, I don't know what the position has been in Northamptonshire with the ending of a lot of the Sure Start initiatives, but in a way, one of the things we really need to do is bring together a lot of what's already going on into a kind of Sure Start Mark II, because that support for families, and particularly families in stress, was beginning to prove valuable and effective. On the housing point, Helen, I mean, I've been involved with housing associations in Liverpool for 40 years, and I'm familiar with that agenda. And I mean, the tenants of council housing and of third sector housing include some of the most disadvantaged people, and that extends to behaviour and conflict with the law and alcohol and drug abuse and so on. And the bigger housing associations often recognise that and have dedicated workers who work with their tenants on the issues that are causing them problems. And I think that is an entry point that can be very important, because in supporting the adult tenants in the issues that they're dealing with, we can begin to make childhood better for their children. So you're doing primary prevention, hopefully with the kids, and secondary prevention with the adults, the tenants. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. We need to look at all these different areas that the council has an influence over and say, where can we do primary prevention? Where do we need to be doing secondary prevention? Because that will, in the end, not in a short term, but 10, 20, 30 years down the road, get the dividends that we're really after, I believe, anyway.
Brilliant, John. That was really helpful, and I think on the young people, children and young people front, that just strengthens, I think, probably the views of this panel that has to be really key in delivering good mental health services. That prevention role and working with young children and young people is absolutely vital if we're going to have good mental health across the system. I think so that's important that we take that forward. I think the housing point's important, and I think you articulated that really well as to what the opportunities are there. I'm going to go to King and then to Russell, and then if everybody's happy, perhaps we'll move on to talk a bit more about the elective collaborative after that. Obviously, if people have any views beyond that, because it's a long and complicated document, and it might occur to you later on there's something else you wanted to bring up that you forgot, by all means email me or David, because I think the more that we feed back and get our views into this system early, the better. So King, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. As sort of following on from my comments before, and actually just sort of following on this prevention piece with children, the voluntary sector plays such a vital role. So understanding how the NFT feeds into that is into those voluntary sector, those groups that really know particular issues that are causing mental health and strain for our younger children. I'll give you a couple of examples. Family Link, that I met a few months ago, they deal with children that have parents that are involved with drug abuse and substance abuse, and they're such a sort of a small group, but they know directly what to do, how to support those children that are sort of otherwise wrapped into a system of a sort of a lifestyle of having to watch their parents in all sorts of messy situations with substance abuse. So sort of working with those sorts of groups. And I think the bigger, one of the bigger issues for mental health is sort of kids caring for kids. So older siblings at sort of school age caring for their younger siblings because their parents don't want to do it. And this was the other day when I went to speak to weavers, and they told me quite an alarming sort of statistic that 20% of their whole student intake are not in school, because their older kids are caring for the younger kids. And how do we sort of get to those issues? Working with education is within this script, but the voluntary sector and schools do play a vital role within the prevention piece, Chair. Thank you. You're on mute, Chair. Yeah.
The first time I've done it today. Yeah, King, I think I absolutely agree with you. They're really important points. The voluntary and community sector is vital, particularly in delivering at place and within communities that people are comfortable in and know and can feel confident in. So I think that's absolutely right, and we need to make sure that those are reflected within this collaborative, and I believe they are, but we need to be certain that they are. Now, I think didn't we have another hand up a moment ago?
Was I?
Did you want to have a comment?
Very quick. I just wanted to say I really appreciated the points made about this and Sure Starts and the positive effect that had and that started to have. I'm not trying to be controversial. I think we've got to weave in, and we've had conversations about pathways to a better life, a fulfilling life through apprenticeships and other help. And what King was saying is that, yeah, parents can sometimes need as much help as the children, if not more. And they're just going to do the same old thing and get on the treadmill. So I'm really quite excited about the fact that we as a team have got this golden pathway to a better life, and we'll do it through hubs. But I do say that the Sure Start system had started to make some great differences, positive differences.
So I think as well as the point that we're making about, you know, if we're going to be delivering good mental health across the whole of Northamptonshire, it's difficult to see us separating adult mental health care from the children's services and you know, the preventative work that needs to go on there. But also perhaps we can feed into the children and young people pillar, that we see the value of the Sure Start centres, and how can those types of systems or provider models maybe be resurrected within that pillar of work. That might be an opportunity there, Russell.
Could I just say that on the back of what was said, then I'm not giving up on anybody, but we do need to load the budget properly. And prevention is where we need to start the work.
Russell, loading the budget in the right place is absolutely right. I think the problem is when you have a system that puts out fires, you can't take the money away from putting out the fires. You have to find money for both parts.
New money. Need to find new money.
Well, and of course that's the issue, isn't it? But you're absolutely right. We need to rebalance. And as I said before, I think everyone in the health and care systems recognises that, but I'm not sure anybody quite knows how to do it within the financial envelope that they find themselves in. So somehow we have to move the systems. I think they call it leftwards. So we're trying to make sure that we're putting some of that money into the prevention earlier on.
Or pump priming the new initiatives is something which is often used to describe it.
It will save our budget later on.
Yeah,
we have to be brave about that.
Agreed. So, John, you have your hand up again.
Just a couple of points. I mean, this is a good discussion. I think on that point about budget allocations, the problem that generally faces prevention as opposed to treatment services is that the treatment services are, from a public point of view, tend to be very imperative. And unless you actually structurally commit to prevention, the resources always get pulled back into treatment. I mean, the best example of where this has been dealt with is actually from Finland, where over 40 years ago, they passed a Primary Healthcare Act, which specified the proportion of the national health budget that should be spent on primary care, prevention, public health, and as opposed to hospitals. And so they haven't experienced what we've done, which is over the years, less and less has gone to primary and community and more into hospitals. And they have a very strong system built on public health and primary care. So by having programmed budgets and setting out at the beginning to say what proportion of whatever cake you've got is going to be given to each side, then you have to get on with it and make the most of what you've got, and set about building those partnerships with the voluntary sector, with the business community, and so on, to really do your best within the budget that you've got, but not allowing it to be stolen all the time by the acute sector. I think the Sure Start centres, it's really important to make sure this isn't seen as being, a party political matter, because it was a change of government that led to them being reduced. But already there'd been an issue, because when they were first started, they were aimed at the 20% most disadvantaged areas, and then that was opened up to a general population. I think the conversation that I'm already tuning into about the development of hubs, I think is relevant here, because I think by having single point of entry community facilities, this can be much more efficient and can prevent the drift towards having lots of silo initiatives, which are wasteful of resource. And I think strategically, how you can bring things together around neighborhood hubs and single points of access is relevant to this conversation about Sure Start Mark II, if you wish, because there's a lot of things going on out there that are relevant, but they're badged separately, and they may involve different workers accountable in different line management structures, whereas what you need to create is this integrated offer for the local population. So I think those are what I would offer in response to that conversation.
Yeah, thanks, John. So quickly to Ken and David, and then we're going to move on to elective care. I'm no good at sharing, am I?
That's right. I'll be brief. I really wanted to ask Mr. Ashton. He seems as if he is the expert here. Have mental health issues increased enormously over the years? Reason I ask you that is because way back when I was a young man, which was many years ago now, but there didn't seem to be as much mental health issues around as they are now, because we were told if there was something that bothered us and worried us, we were told to get on with it. And most of us did. I had a younger brother who did suffer with mental health issues, and still does actually. And I just feel, looking at the structure system that we spoke about earlier on page 51, if we'd have had this structure then, there'd have been so many people would have been helped an awful lot more. So whether it was recognized in those days, I'm going back 40 years or so, more than that probably, was mental health recognized in the same way that it is now? That was really all I wanted to ask.
No, it wasn't all. It's a big question, actually. And I'd happily talk about it at length, perhaps on another occasion. But I'm interested in the history of these things as well. And if you take the long view, there have been fluctuations in attention and understanding given to mental health issues. So that, in a nutshell, the so-called madness of King George III fed an enlightened period in this country with regard to mental health responses. Until then, the parishes had combined to fund private madhouses, which is where people finished up if they had a major mental illness. And there were lots of scandals because the private madhouse keepers were paid a certain amount of money for each person for a year, and they had no incentive to look after them properly. They were chained up, they were in rags, and they were fed on gruel and so on. George III illness led to the Asylums Act, which created the County Asylums, which were very imaginative at the beginning, and they were like communities which had farms and workshops and creative activities and so on. When they were open, they were filled up almost immediately by relatives bringing their mad relatives out, where they'd been kept hidden in a back room somewhere because they didn't want them to go into the madhouses, the private madhouses. And the asylums were overwhelmed. And over a long period, they began to become a problem in their own way. The big advance after that came after the war with the development of antidepressants and drugs that could treat schizophrenia and things like that. And there was a rather naive belief that meant we could then get rid of all estate-based solutions and have everybody in the community, but there was no concomitant investment in the community facilities, and we've all seen that. So that's been a sort of institutional side of this. When you look at the incidence of mental health problems, then certainly modern life does seem to have produced an increase in some areas, so that the incidence of illness and disturbance among children and adolescents was estimated to be about 10% when I was starting out as a doctor 40 odd years ago. It's now higher than that, and the early indications from the last 2 years is that there's been a significant increase in mental health distress during the pandemic, with self-harm among girls, and those kind of adolescent issues have been increasing significantly. On the other hand, the hard end indicator like suicide, there were significant improvements in suicide rates in the 60s and 70s, and that may have been to do with more openness about discussion of mental health issues and the antidepressants and so on. If I remember rightly, there used to be about 7,000 or 8,000 suicides a year. It's currently around 4,000 or something like that, but it's bounced around in recent years. And there are particular groups who have particular issues. I already mentioned men around the age of 40 and so on. And there's always been an issue of suicide among people with physical illness. And that's always been something where, quality of medical care is important, notwithstanding the discussion about end of life. So it's a complex subject, Councillor Harrington. I'm happy to wax lyrical on it on any occasion you ask me, but I don't think we've got time this morning.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for your answer, though. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thanks, John. It's always an education talking to you. David, then we'll move on to elective.
To be fair, Chair, I expected a lot more discussion on the mental health collaborative than the other element than the elective care. 2 points really. So picking up on Russell's questions about making sure we load the budget in the right place. And what I would say is it's notoriously difficult to be able to evidence preventative outcomes in a way that institutions say it's worth putting money in there. It's much easier to say it costs this much to run a mental health hospital and you need this many staff to do it, than to say, well, we did this and it stopped someone ever needing any of that, or it delayed them needing any of that. And that's part of the challenge, is around building a system that recognises that it's difficult to evidence the impact of that in a way that warrants additional solution and convinces you that, well, actually, you could reduce down the number of acute mental health beds because of your preventative approach. approaches, because effectively to move the money from one part of the system, those are the things that you need to do. You have to reduce something in one area, or you have to make a decision that you are going to take the whole health budget and move monies away from physical health interventions to invest into mental health in that sense. So that's point number one. The other, which John's touched on a little bit, I would say, is stigma as well. So this is in relation to Ken's question. John's touched a little bit on stigma. When I did my social work training, I met with some people who've been in long stay mental health institutions, and they told me about their lives in those. Some of our approaches to managing ill mental health, even as late as the late 80s and early 90s, were still archaic in their approaches. So people that physically bit members of staff having their teeth removed as an intervention. So, you know, these sorts of things were still happening in what I would describe as modern society, in what John has described as a more enlightened age around mental health. But there is still a stigma around mental health now, and we all have our own different ways of dealing with that. I work in a a high pressured environment. I have moments where, you know, I struggle with anxiety and those sorts of things, and I've been very open about that with my colleagues, and, you know, have had to seek support for that in the past. But in my early career, would I have said that? Probably not, because it would have been something. And would I have sought support from formal services? Probably not, because I was concerned about, well, could that affect my career, or you know, the things that were important to me at the time. And if it, you know, I'm reasonably intelligent, and if I have taken that approach over my career, there are thousands of other people that will have as well. You know, a stigma of admitting that something's wrong, or being worried about what the impact might be on other parts of your life if you were to seek support or help in those. And you know, that's where it's a slightly different perspective, but that's where we need to make sure our wellbeing policies as a local authority are ones that we can hold up and say, every institution needs to be encouraging support and, you know, wellbeing approaches. So it's not just about what we do within the health service or within the mental health collaborative. It's how we work with local businesses to make sure that they recognise poor mental health early on, and they've got support networks in place. As King rightly referred to, you know, schools are noting that, you know, when things could be having a demonstrable impact on someone's mental health, and getting in early and providing that pastoral care to try and deal with those issues early on.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think those points are absolutely spot on. I think probably we'd all recognise that. And interestingly, my oldest brother, I have 2 brothers and 4 sisters, so I'm always talking about what my brothers and sisters do. And you probably think, how many blooming brothers and sisters has she got? So 2 brothers and 4 sisters. My eldest brother works in a large engineering firm, and he's, you know, up in management these days. And he was trained as a mental health first aider, and they have a series of mental health first aiders throughout the company. You know, those sorts of things are quite a big step forward, and things that we can be promoting in our communities and within the council. In fact, it's something I'd like to do, David, at some point, is do the mental health first aid training. It'd be a good thing to do. So, you know, we can see that the steps forwards are being taken, and actually sometimes they can be very low cost, effective things that can be put in place across the community. And I think that's one. So, but yeah, absolutely, David, I think that's spot on. So, you know, this has been a brilliant discussion. I knew it would be. I think it's a huge topic, and I think it shows the importance of you know, our part in this collaborative. Us as a council, we need to have a strong voice in that to help to shape it. and to bring some of these things forward, so that because we know our bit, we know the things that we can do within public health, in housing, in social care, and working with our voluntary sector partners, we know the good things we can do, and we probably know where we want to be able to do more. And if we can encourage some of that funding to help us to do more, then within the collaborative, that will be really good. So I think that just shows the importance of us being able to see this quite early on. So thank you all for that discussion. As David said, we probably will have slightly less to say on the elective care collaborative, one because it's a less developed plan, but probably also because it might feel, although there's a lot of different moving parts, it may feel sort of more familiar and perhaps a bit simpler to us. I'm not sure, but I mean, from my reading through of it, some of the simple things that's going to be designed into the new system is, like a single patient treatment list, for example, and a single point of referral for primary care for GPs. Things like that just seem to make a huge amount of sense. I think, making sure that patients aren't being handed from one system to another, lots of handovers, lots of having to tell your story multiple times, it all sounds very sensible from that point of view. How we're involved in that, I think, is perhaps, I'm trying to think of things, where we're involved. I was talking to some of our heads of service with David and Samantha just on Wednesday, and we were talking about reablement services and how we need to align those more closely with the I can never remember the names of all the different services, but
with things like intermediate care teams.
Exactly. I was saying in my head, I was going intermittent. You know what I'm like with words, intermittent, not intermittent. The intermediate care service, exactly, with those teams within the NHS. So there's clearly areas where our services need to be more closely aligned, so we're not repeating the same work that other parts of the service are doing. Again, I think sort of, in terms of public health, there are things like our frailty teams. Well, that's actually more social care, but we have the falls prevention teams. There's all sorts of different services that will be working with people, again, to help to prevent need further down the line and getting people out of hospital at the other end. So we are involved in this pathway at this collaborative. So, over to you guys for your thoughts on this and get a conversation going, because there's a lot in it. But again, I think it's perhaps not quite as juicy as the mental health one, maybe. King.
Thanks, Chair. I think you've absolutely touched on one point that I wanted to make with the reablement and enabling people to increase hospital capacity ultimately, so more treatments and more elective care appointments can be done. And I think you've mentioned that there's already something within Northamptonshire, and I think David alluded to that on a few meetings back, but sort of scaling that up on a more on a larger basis, so more is being done, sort of a rapid response style thing is being done in people's homes, working with social care partners, rather than sort of patients or service users being stuck at hospital for inordinate periods of time. So I think there can be some more done around that. But one of the things actually that sort of ties into the whole mental health part is one thing this collaborative could look at, and I know it's not fully developed, but a sort of a local campaigns that can be led by the council to reduce sort of bad food consumption and alcohol and smoking and all those things in a sort of bid to reduce sort of health issues, taking away those appointments. So if we're doing our part in as a council to sort of promote and incentivize almost better eating, alcohol consumption, sort of reducing that, and smoking, etc., then more people won't be developing those issues in order to take up those spaces in hospital. I know it's sort of sporadic thinking, but it is something that we could do in sort of promoting better health locally. And that's where I'm up to at the moment with my thoughts, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, King, that's absolutely right. You know, in terms of one of the things that's talked about in this collaborative is, again, shifting people into, yes, some preventative work, but also other forms of treatment, sort of intermediate stuff. So I think you're right. You know, if we, as you know, within our public health remit, we're doing a lot of, you know, obviously we do a lot of work on smoking cessation, healthy eating strategies, anti-obesity strategies, drug treatment, alcohol treatment, and you know, promoting healthy exercise, and all of those things will have a knock-on effect to the number of people who need elective heart surgery or even elective joint surgery. You know, more and more we're understanding that, you know, if you've got arthritis in your knees, that shouldn't stop you exercising, and in fact, exercising and keeping strong and flexible is good for you, not bad for you. But messages in the past have always been, oh, if it hurts, you should rest, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you'll make your arthritis worse, which isn't true. And so actually people become more and more deconditioned and then more likely to need a knee replacement rather than to be able to manage without one. Having joint replacement surgery isn't always the right thing to do. But often it is done, even if it's, you know, because somebody becomes so deconditioned that they have worsened and their pain is worse and their mobility is worse. So you're absolutely right that, you know, within primary care, there's, you know, physios, OTs working in primary care, really necessary. Public health messaging, really necessary. And then the frailty teams working with our older cohort of people who, you know, have perhaps multiple conditions and keeping them as strong and healthy as possible. All of those things are going to reduce the burden on elective care. But as David was saying earlier on, it's very difficult to evidence the effect of that. It's very difficult to say, you know, the work we did with this patient actually prevented them from needing to go and have surgery. You don't know, because you don't know what would have been the outcome had you not done it. You know what I mean? But those are all really important things. And that's why I think we need to be a part of this collaborative and be engaged with it and so on. So I think that's absolutely right, King. Did you want to come back? Because you got your hand up still.
Oh, no, right.
That's fine. Russell.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I like the idea of one list as long as there are elements. This is not an easy thing to do, because obviously you've got people who have need. They need this operation, but there are other people with a small intervention could completely transform their lives. So that's not going to be an easy one. And if we just take, say, obesity, one of the things that we could do is commit ourselves to ensuring that young people, or anybody for that matter, have got the facilities to exercise. A lot of, and it's anecdotal, but you just feel as though over the last 20 years, school sports has gone one way, and it's not gone the way I would like it. You know, we all used to take the odd note to the sports master and say, please, I can't go out on the football pitch today. I haven't got any shorts. And there was always a box full of shorts. You're out. You're going out there, and you'd enjoy it at the end of the day. But as far as this is concerned, I think we have to engage the community, because there's been an unlocking of connectivity between the GPs and their patients on this through the COVID, through no fault of anybody. It's just the way things have gone. And I think as long as we're fair about it, we're going to be okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Your point about young people and getting exercise and being fit and healthy. Again, I don't know at all because I'm not engaged with schools and what they're doing, but I also have the overall impression that the amount of physical exercise in school has reduced, but I wouldn't be able to swear to that. But your point about having access to places to exercise is an interesting one. I'm constantly banging on, well, not quite constantly, but I would love to see, for example, our country parks within Northamptonshire have free car parking, because if you're not very well off, you're only going to be able to afford to go once in a while when it costs £3.60 every time you want to go and park there, go and run around the park or go for a walk or whatever. However, we've got all sorts of. I was in Corby on Wednesday with David, and I was commenting on how much green space there actually is in Corby. Yeah, there is loads.
Yeah.
And actually we could utilize those spaces much better if we made them, probably with not massive outlay of funds, to make them more accessible, more inviting, have different things in there, and then you'd have a free place for people in the community to go and exercise and get fresh air away from the cars and so on. So there are opportunities, and again, as a council, we need to look at those things and get on with improving that offering, I would say.
I like your idea, Chair, of opening up the car parks, but I would also suggest to you that, from any centre like Corby Kettering or anywhere else like that, if there was some sort of free bus that people could get on to go and visit the park. And I love the idea of opening up the green spaces with cycle tracks, walking tracks, running tracks, and all the rest of the plethora of getting people out to see what's on their doorstep. But it's anecdotal, but you just get the feeling that there's less exercise going on in schools, and we're going to reap a poor outcome if we're not careful.
Yeah,
we're already doing that.
Yeah, and I would just say on the car parking thing, I'm getting a reasonable amount of resistance because it's all about funding and being able to
wait until they hear about my suggestion on buses.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it wrong.
No, but it's a bit sad how often it all comes down to money. But interesting. Okay, now this is absolutely just an observation, and I mean this. I don't mean this in any way to be judgmental about anybody, but I live right on the edge of Urchester Country Park, so I'm there most days, and the majority of people that walk past me are speaking in an Eastern European language. It's amazing how much they want to use those facilities and get out and exercise in comparison with people who are born and bred in this country. Now, I can't swear that that's absolutely true, but there are probably cultural issues around getting people to exercise as well, not just making sure the facilities are there. We need to make sure people want to use them. And for some reason, it seems to me that there's a cultural issue around going and using the facilities that are available.
I would suggest to you that I've noticed in Barton Seagrove, where I live, a lot more people are going out walking, especially at the weekends when they've finished their week's work. A lot since the lockdown, when people did that. Not everybody stopped doing it. And what we've got to do is catch that opportunity and lift the spirits and challenge people to use the facilities that are on their doorstep. They don't realise the wonder of some of the walkways that they've got there. And we've got to open those walkways up. We've got to cut back the trees that are overhanging and all the rest of it and make it simpler. And put some signage up as well. Don't hide your bush and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's about time we did start to utilise the place where we live to stay as healthy as we possibly can. Because when you're changing, you're absolutely right. When you're changing a joint, you've pretty much got to the wrong end of the project, haven't you? You're having to sort of chop one out and put a new one in. It's a shame. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to
Solves the
suggest that.
problem.
I wouldn't want to suggest that some people, you know, are having joint replacements because of their lifestyle. An awful lot of joint degeneration is down to your genes. So, you know, genetically, some of us are more likely to end up having joint replacement than others. It's not just about a poor lifestyle, but there, you know, there are alternatives, and not everybody who has joint replacements necessarily would have had to have them had they had better treatment earlier on or better advice earlier on. Okay, so Jeff, over to you now.
Yeah, thanks. If I can just go back to schools and the amount of exercise they get there, I think it's true, it has very much diminished, and it's been replaced, and this is what does concern me, by after school clubs. And of course, you have to pay for the children to go to it. So what's happening is the better off parents are paying for their children to go there, and the ones that can't really afford are missing out. And that takes me on to the country parks, because if you go to Barnwell Country Park, Helen, you'll see that the lay-by is always full of cars parked, and they tend to be people who are better off than the ones that actually park in the car park. So, you know, that's just an observation, really. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the parking happen, you know, people finding ways to park and use the parks without paying for the car parking happens in all of the all the parks. I think it's mostly first come, first serve. So once the lay-by is full up, then everyone else has to go somewhere else, or they park on the verges. But again, that does show that people want to use the parks, but don't necessarily want to pay to use the parks, and maybe think that it should be covered by their council tax. But it's a big issue, because obviously as soon as we take away the parking charges, then theoretically there's less money to then invest in the parks themselves, and we would have to find a new model of funding that, which would probably mean having to commercialize the parks more if you're going to bring more money into them, so that you don't have to have car parking charges. And is that what we want? So, you know, there's a lot of questions around that, but yes, increasing access to healthy spaces is always, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. And if you have charges, the people who are most likely to suffer from poor health are the least likely people to be able to use them. So, which is not really a very sensible way forward. John.
Yeah, all the interest in the preventive end, and you know, again, happy to talk about that at length on other occasions. But I wanted to try and just get back a bit to the elective care side of this item, because I think there's a sense in which the acute and specialist sector, it seems to enjoy a sort of protective status, and so it doesn't get challenged about what they're doing and where they're doing it. You know, my grandfather was a gardener. My father left school at 14 and went to work in the brewery office as a sort of office boy. And but we grew up in a village on the edge of Liverpool where all the ship owners had their big mansions. You know, and my dad used to say, you could never imagine growing up in the 20s having a car. The only people who had cars were the doctor and all these folk who, you know, ran the Blue Star Line and all the rest of Harrison Lines, fast daily sailings to Spain and all of that. And yet today, most people have a car, access to a car. Many households have 2 or 3. And you say, well, how did that happen? This highly sophisticated bit of machinery that's within reach of ordinary people. And what happened was they put all the R&D into the development, and then having done it, they mass produced it and rolled it out at a fraction of the cost. We don't do that in medicine. The people who do the R&D carry on doing the individual operations and so on. So you've got the most expensive people doing things that really should or maybe could be rolled out and democratized and put into the community and made much more accessible. I'll give you one example. I have a very good friend whose high-powered person in Northwest Arts who has, well, she's now had a second kidney transplant, but for many years she had no functioning kidneys. But she was living a very busy life, internationally, advising on culture and arts and so on. And what she was able to report on was how people deal with dialysis in different countries. So in this country, we were very slow to take dialysis out of the hospital. In France, you will find a community facility in most places, which is often a house, that the person needing dialysis can just book in and let themselves in with a code on the door and put themselves on the dialysis machine 3 times a week and do the dialysis. So, you know, this whole issue about the inertia and the expense of the location of doing things is one aspect about the way we've put hospitals on a pedestal or, you know, at the top of the hill, and nobody will challenge their ways of operating. So for me, the challenge about balance of care between specialist care and primary and community care relates to this issue about how do you get the quart out of a pint pot? You know, how do you make 1 + 1 = 3? And you've got to be prepared to be dynamic about how you provide services. And that's been very, very difficult with the NHS since it began. I think the key to this could lie with the integrated care system. But the people who are going to be on the integrated care system boards need to be in a position to challenge these inertias and to explore options and opportunities for doing things differently, including maybe community-led partnerships. You know, before the NHS and in the 30s, some of the biggest cities ran their own hospital systems. Birmingham's an example. But, you know, maybe North Northampton could actually be a lead provider of some of the services that are currently being provided by the NHS in hospitals, but could be provided in a community, in large health centres, which are an option when you can have a big health centre with 10 or 20 doctors and specialists operating for a population of 30,000 or so. There are models of this. So I think what we need really is to empower the local council to think bigger about how to reshape what's going on in the secondary and tertiary sector, bring things closer to home, and with greater integration and access for local communities. So that's a kind of big conceptual strategic point, but one which maybe we could give some thought to.
Yeah, John, that's really helpful. You're right about the inertia. It's amazing how slow it's been, even to have things as simple as people doing X-rays in communities and things like that. You know, that used to be the only place you'd get an X-ray would be in a hospital. Now you can thankfully get that in the community, and that's a really simple thing. So you know, we need to push for more of those sorts of things. And I would say also specialists coming out of the hospital, perhaps well either to do online assessments and so on, but actually to come out of the hospital and see people in their communities rather than making them drive over to the big secondary care hospital. David, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious we've got 15 minutes left, or less than 15 minutes, and this conversation has been a little bit more nebulous in the way that it's gone. I think probably from the comment that John's made there, I've captured one sort of bit of feedback, which is about how will the collaborative challenge itself to be more dynamic and innovative in the way that it provides elective care. You know, can it be a bit more blue sky thinking in some of the solutions that it's coming up with? And I think the example that John's provided there of you know, self-administered dialysis is a really, really, you know, clever and innovative way, and we might want to include that as just one small example of things that we don't necessarily see happening at the moment, but could be picked up in the future in that sense. Just for a point of clarity, elected members will not have a place on the Integrated Care Board. They will have a place or be able to contribute to the Integrated Care Partnership. And I think that's probably the level where we need to understand that we can be influencing in that sense. That's not a decision that's been made locally. That has been nationally mandated by government, that elected members will not have a place on the Integrated Care Boards. However, senior officers, i.e. chief executives, will be invited. What we have lobbied for more locally is that deputies to chief executives are also invited, because Rob would rightly say, I defer to people like Lucy and David and John for the advice around our relationships in the work that we're doing with the NHS, or in challenging some of that. So, you know, Rob's role as a chief executive is a generalist. He, you know, is expected to know a little about a lot of things, and he employs me and people like John to know a bit more about a few less things, if that makes sense. And so we have put that challenge in. Like I've sold us really badly there, haven't I, John? But
that's fine.
I think you all get we're masters of our trade. I think Rob has to be a bit more of a jack of all trades. Is probably a better way of describing it in that sense. But I do wonder if there's any more definitive recommendations or requests that we could be putting forward. Again, when I've read through it, you haven't touched on it, but you know, there's wise words around what we want to do to increase, you know, elective care treatments by, you know, 10 to 30% between now and 24, 25. But the reality of how you do that isn't necessarily set out in the document yet around the plans, and that may be because of the early elements of development. Again, there are significant links with the integrated care across Northamptonshire pillar, which is very much focusing on hospital flow and pre-admission, but some of the ways that you know, you can free up elective care capacity in surgical and orthopedic wards is by planning your admissions really well. So do you need to provide as much hospital aftercare and rehabilitation for a you know, a younger adult who is perhaps more mobile, who's having some form of elective care, in comparison to, you know, someone who's 75 plus going in for their first you know, hip operation or knee operation, and doing that planning early, and thinking about what are the arrangements that you need to have in place to facilitate an earlier discharge, because Helen will hopefully agree with me, quite often lots of people spend time sat in hospital beds awaiting discharge arrangements, and it's much better. And you know, there's statistics out there, and John will probably know them, but for every day that you you know, spend in a hospital bed longer than you need to, attributes to you know, a month of deterioration in muscle wastage, or I'm not sure I've used the right one, and Helen, you probably as a physio have the correct one, but you know, it's those sorts of examples. So you know, planning the discharge for certain cohorts of people and making sure that you've got the care already in place and the rehab plans already in place before you admit them to hospital is key in that sense. And I would openly admit we don't do that well at the moment, but does that fall into the elective care collaborative, or does it fall into the ICANN pillar of work that we're doing? And how do we make sure, again, similar to the mental health and children's pillars, how do we make sure that there's read across and that the two are influencing each other?
Yeah, I think that's right, David. I think it does fit into this one as well as ICANN, because you know, elective care by its very nature is planned. If it's planned, it should be planned across the whole system, not just parts of the system. And if that's going to involve the planning of care before and after the actual elective treatment, then you know that needs to be fed into this pillar. Clearly, it's part of ICANN, but I'm not sure that we sort of get. I don't. You'll be able to tell me. I don't know whether we get advance notice that X person is going to be going into full surgery on such and such a date, and can you get ready to plan for their discharge now? I don't know if that really happens much, but it might.
I don't think it's as as clear as that. I think where we are already working with people, so we may already be supporting someone who's been struggling with, for example, mobility or self-care as a result of the issue that they're going into hospital for. We'd probably be working with those people, but there may be a cohort of people who haven't had social care involvement, but we know that their journey through hospital is likely to mean that they're going to have care or reablement needs post-discharge that are non-health related, and it may be the responsibility that we would be delivering from a social care perspective. And equally, it goes back to that question around, do you pay an expensive therapist in hospital to do it, or do we look at how we develop our social care workforce to deliver reablement plans, physiotherapy plans, occupational therapy plans in people's own homes on behalf of the NHS in the community? So not local authority funded care, but almost NHS funded reablement plans, so that you can free your elective care beds up for more surgery to take place or more care to take place. I do agree with the clinics as well, so outpatients being delivered much closer to communities. There's been some really good community of interest examples as well, and the one which I always refer to was one that I was aware of in Coventry called the Ripple Project, which was a consultant, a cardiothoracic consultant that would meet groups of his patients in local community buildings, but they built up their own peer network of support as well. So people who were struggling with breathing and you know, heart conditions in that sense, building their own peer support network. And they started, you know, they developed things like a choir, because recognizing the benefits of you know, singing to help with breathing and things like that. So much more holistic approaches to treatment of patient cohorts that can be delivered better in local communities.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So just go to Russell and then John, and if you're all okay, we're probably going to go about 10 minutes over, just to finalize, quickly go through the last few things on the agenda.
Yes, I was going to bring up the clinic idea out in the community, like pain, diabetes, phlebotomy and such like. It's also got the benefit of actually bringing some of the treatment into the community for the community, within walking distance, dare I say. I think David's made a very good case for considering that. But I'll leave it at that, because we are sort of getting short of time.
Thanks, Russell. And over to you, John.
Yeah, just 2 quick points, Helen. David's point is well taken, and you know, I mean, we may be able to build on some of the experience in the pandemic, though, where there was a lot of pressure to get people out of hospital to free up the beds, and you know, what was put in place to do that. Because if we are to optimize the use of community-based activity, then that can really move down the path, as David said, of being NHS funded. That is a win-win for the NHS, for the community, for families, if that's funded to be done by partners in the community. So that's one thing. And just a small point, I mean, I mean, I will be having a general anaesthetic on Tuesday for my ENT issues that I have, but I have every intention of working on Wednesday. Now, that's made easier by remote working. And there may be something to think about in terms of the council's new ways of working that recognises that people may not need to take extended time off work if they're having procedures done, if they're able to work from home. So it may fit into the hybrid model that we're working up, really. That, you know, I mean, I would hope to be sufficiently recovered from a GA by Tuesday night to be able to come and function normally on the computer on Wednesday. So I just make that point, really.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thanks, John. So as always, we've had a really good discussion on those two papers. And I think there's a wealth of stuff to be fed back on the mental health collaborative. There's a decent amount, I think, there to be fed back on the elective care collaborative. So, and as I said before, if you have any other thoughts that you want to feed in, you know, over the next day or two, please do. And we'll make sure that, you know, all our points are fed into the system. And then hopefully get sort of a response to that, you know, get a bit of a, okay, we said all these things, you know, how have you taken those into account in the further planning type of session. So that would be really good. You've got the forward plan of executive items in your pack. Is there anything that you wanted to raise from that to bring to this group, or just anything else from that? It seems not. You have the work programme. Any comments on that? Good. And then just some quick updates from David. So David, just to remind you, if you haven't got the agenda in front of you, it's the Local Resilience Forum update, ICS, which we've pretty much covered. Public health arrangements, you've got John here, so we'll be able to quickly whiz through that. Poverty Truth Commission and the multi-use community building. So if you can quickly cover off those things, that would be great.
Absolutely. So members may be aware that the Local Resilience Forum declared a major incident in Northamptonshire in order to support the challenges that were being experienced, particularly within the healthcare sector, and that were being particularly experienced within West Northamptonshire's social care sector as well. The reason for calling a major incident is to put in place arrangements where, if we needed to, we could call on other statutory organisations such as the police, the fire service, or the regional local resilience support to access additional elements of staffing, etc., to support some of the challenges that we've got. That did result in auxiliary staff from the armed forces coming in and supporting within our acute hospital sectors. So only a small amount of staff, and clearly they weren't uniformed or armed at the time, but they came in to provide additional support in those settings. I think it was, we were allowed up to 8 members of staff for each of the acute hospitals in Northamptonshire. We had we've been reviewing the major incident at a local resilience forum level on a weekly basis, and there's been a number of groups that feed into that, such as tactical coordination groups and strategic coordination groups. And the recommendation yesterday was that with the stabilisation of rates, so we had been expecting a significantly greater number of people to be acutely unwell if we were to follow similar patterns to what had been seen in London and the North East, but our trajectory within Northamptonshire hasn't followed that. That's not to say that the pressure has gone away. It's still there. It's still very tight. There's still risks within the system, but it was believed that those risks could predominantly be managed through our existing business as usual channels. So the recommendation was made yesterday that we would be standing down the major incident. I'm not sure that's been communicated externally at the moment, but I don't think that there's any reason why we shouldn't share that with you. It will be going through the churning of just pulling together the comms statements, etc. at the moment. So I just wanted to be aware of that. Any questions on the major incident? No, brilliant. I think we've touched on elements of the integrated care system. We had been due to have a discussion around progress at Scrutiny Commission earlier this week, but I requested that that was removed. Main reason being is that central government and relevant government departments recommended that systems delayed formal implementation of their integrated care systems, which had been intended to run from April, and have pushed that back until June, July time to enable local systems across the country to focus on how we managed some of the challenges we were experiencing as a result of the more highly transmissible Omicron variant of COVID-19. So that's the main update that I would provide there. So any questions or comments? No? Obviously, we've got John here today, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of an update on public health. Obviously, you'll all be aware of the decision that was agreed and recognised at full council, I think in December, around the disaggregation of public health and the creation of 2 posts of public health directors, one for North Northamptonshire, one for West Northamptonshire. In addition to that, one of the bits of information that I would share with you is that Lucy has successfully secured a post working for Essex County Council and will be joining them at the end of March, start of April, which leaves us then without having a substantive Director of Public Health, hence why we have John here. John, in mine and Rob's opinion, is a very experienced both practitioner but also leader in public health, and we wanted to bring someone in to support us, to provide stability, assist us with the recruitment of a substantive Director of Public Health, and help us develop the early thinking around our strategy, but also the potential structural options that we have to deliver that strategy moving forward. So, officially welcome John within this group, but I do believe, we wanted to create some stability. It's really important to our public health team that we did that, and by getting John in early, so at the start of January, to give us the best part of 3 months to work over transition with Lucy. And then officially John will take on our interim Director of Public Health role from the start of April for a period of 6 months to enable us to finalise our current recruitment, which we've already got out to, and hopefully allow the successful individual to serve an adequate period of notice and still have a transition period where both they and John are working together to transition from the interim arrangement to our next, or officially the first permanent appointment of a Director of Public Health solely for North Northamptonshire. So that's the update on public health. But again, any questions? No. Final one was Poverty Truth Commission. So just by way of update on the Poverty Truth Commission, members may be aware that Executive supported the establishment of a Poverty Truth Commission a number of months ago, actually. I think it was the early part of November, and agreed that we would put funding into that. To be fair, with a lot of the challenges that we've had, that had slipped on my personal agenda. However, we have reinstigated the approach with that, and established an approach with Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire to help developing our approach to a Poverty Truth Commission. My discussions with Russell Rolfe, who is Chief Exec of VIN, is that Poverty Truth Commissions work well. When there's a slow burn to them, you want to take communities with you, you want communities to be involved with that. So the establishment of our approach will happen between now and the end of March, with us moving more into a launch phase from April onwards.
David, there was just one more thing, that was the multi-use building.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't write that one down. So yes, members will recall that we had a presentation at the previous EAP around the multi-use building that formed part of our town's deal bid to government in Corby, where I think we put a submission in for approximately 25 million. We were awarded 20 million. And a number of the projects have had to reduce in their scope. As a result of that, we discussed at our previous meeting about whether we wanted to give some advice back to Helen and the executive as to whether the council might consider bridging the gap between the original proposal and the now revised proposal. So the original proposal, if you recall, was a completely new build community hub building, multi-use community building, whereas the revised one was about refurbishing some existing building in Corby as an alternative. The executive have listened to that and have given instruction for us that they'd like to know more information about how those proposals could work. And we've tasked the officers that are leading on that to bring forward 2 outline business cases that we would then seek agreement for exec to recommend either one or the other for us to then take forward to full business case for our proposals back to central government on that.
Fabulous. That's great. So it doesn't look like there's any questions on that, but good update to keep you informed about how things are moving on. So thank you, everybody, for your attendance today. As usual, you came along with lots of enthusiasm and thoughts. We have, I'm afraid, run 11 minutes over. I'm a terrible chairperson, I'm sorry. But I will see you all at our next EAP and look forward to another brilliant discussion. So take care, everybody. See you all soon, and thanks so much.